I've spent 40 years building a life that looked good from the outside. A career in finance, a house in the suburbs, a marriage that seemed solid, or at least that's what I told myself. My wife Sarah wanted to believe it too, I think. We had 2 kids, both grown now, and our daughter Emma had married a man named Derek 5 years ago. I remember the wedding like it was yesterday. Derek charmed everyone with his smile and his easy way of talking. He had money too, or seemed to anyway. The kind that comes with expensive suits and first-class flights and reservations at restaurants you can't get into. The wedding was at the country club. Emma looked beautiful in her mother's wedding dress, the one Sarah had saved for this moment for years. I remember walking her down the aisle and feeling the way fathers do at weddings, that mix of pride and loss. Derek was at the altar and he smiled, and everything looked perfect. I watched him dance with Emma and felt proud, like I'd done my job as a father. Looking back, I was completely blind. I ignored the little moments, the way he'd correct Emma during stories, making sure everyone knew the details as he remembered them. The way he'd laugh at her jokes, but with a tone that suggested they weren't actually funny. The way he'd check his phone constantly at dinner, always making sure people knew he had somewhere more important to be. My wife Sarah wasn't blind though. She saw through him faster than I did. I remember one night, maybe 6 months after the wedding, she came to me in the kitchen. Derek and Emma had just left after a family dinner. Sarah had been quiet most of the evening. "There's something off about him," she said to me while I was loading the dishwasher. "Something that doesn't feel right. Did you see how he talked to Emma? Like she was a child?" I told her she was being paranoid, that she was letting her protective mother instincts run away with her. I told her to trust that Emma was smart enough to see Derek for who he really was. Emma had graduated from university with honours. She had a good job in marketing. She was intelligent and independent. Surely she wouldn't stay with someone if something was actually wrong. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. But I didn't know it yet. Not on that night when everything exploded in a way I never saw coming. The dinner started normally enough. It was late November, just before the holidays, and we were all gathered around my wife's table in our dining room. Sarah had spent the whole day cooking, and the food was excellent as always. My brother Tom was there with his wife Linda, my daughter Emma and Derek, and a few close friends. Everyone was drinking wine and the conversation was flowing easily. I remember feeling genuinely happy when the evening started. I remember thinking that this was what life was supposed to be about, these moments with people you loved, gathered together, sharing a meal, sharing conversation. Sarah had made roasted chicken and her famous mashed potatoes and a salad with fresh herbs from our garden. There was homemade bread and good butter, and the kind of warmth that comes from being surrounded by people who matter to you. Emma was wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes. She looked happy too, though I realised now there was a tension in her that I completely missed. A tightness in the way she was smiling, like she was waiting for something to happen. Derek had a few drinks in him, and he was becoming louder, more expansive, the way he always gets when he's had too much. He was telling some story about a business deal he'd done, some conversation with a client where he'd supposedly gotten the upper hand and made a fortune. Everyone was listening politely, smiling at the appropriate moments. My brother Tom was eating his chicken, focused on his plate. Linda was sipping her wine. Our friends were nodding along. And then Derek, mid-story, somehow changed course. The conversation turned to me. Derek was talking about my career, my job, the choices I'd made. He was saying things like, "You've had a decent life, I guess, but let's be honest, you never really made it big. And you played it safe your whole life, and that's why you're not rich like me." I heard the words, but they didn't really register at first. I was focused on my plate, on cutting my chicken, on not making a scene. Sarah shot me a look from across the table, that worried look she gets when she senses something's about to go wrong, like she could feel the temperature in the room dropping. Emma was looking at her hands, studying her napkin. My brother Tom cleared his throat and tried to change the subject, something about a project at work, but Derek just talked right over him. And then Derek stood up. He'd had maybe 4 glasses of wine at that point, maybe 5, and I could see he was working himself up into something, building towards something for a while now. He started pacing around the table, gesturing dramatically with his wine glass, spilling a little on my wife's white tablecloth. He was talking louder about how I was a relic, a man who'd never taken real risks, never done anything that mattered. How my whole life was proof that playing it safe was a waste of time. How nobody cared about my pension or my steady job because the world only respected winners, real winners, men who made real money. And I was not a winner. He said it directly to me, pointing his finger. "You're not a winner. You never were and you never will be." That's when he picked up the bowl of soup. It was the soup Sarah had made, a butternut squash soup she had spent 40 minutes preparing, pureeing the squash, seasoning it just right, and it was still steaming hot in its ceramic bowl. Derek was still talking, still making his point about my failures, when he picked it up from the table and threw it directly in my face. The heat was immediate and overwhelming. My face felt like it was on fire. The soup was scalding, probably around 180 degrees, and it hit my face and my neck and my chest where it had splashed on my shirt. I gasped, and everyone went silent. You could hear the clock on the wall ticking. The soup dripped down my face. I could feel the burning on my cheeks, my forehead, my neck spreading across my skin. My eyes were watering, and Derek was smiling. That's what I'll never forget. He was smiling like he'd just done something clever, like he'd made a brilliant move in a game only he understood, and he was waiting for everyone to acknowledge his brilliance. Sarah stood up so fast her chair fell backward and clattered against the hardwood floor. She was coming around the table toward Derek, anger on her face. But Emma, my daughter, my Emma said something that cut deeper than any heat ever could. She said, "He's right, Dad. You deserved that." There was a pause, and then she said, "You've always been holding him back, always questioning him, always acting like you're better than he is. I didn't say anything. What was there to say?" I wiped my face with my napkin and I walked toward the door. I felt the burning on my face and the burning in my chest. A different kind of burn, the kind that comes from betrayal by the people you love most. I left the dining room and went to the kitchen where no one could see me. Sarah tried to follow, but I held up a hand. I needed a moment alone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Morris, a man I'd worked with for 8 years before I left law enforcement. We'd stayed in touch loosely over the years, saw each other maybe once a year, but we'd never forgotten the bond we'd formed on the job. We'd been through things together that forge a kind of connection that doesn't go away. "It's me," I said quietly when he picked up. "I need your help. I need you to look into someone." I gave him Derek's full name, Derek James Mitchell, and told him I suspected financial crimes, fraud of some kind, possibly embezzlement or investment fraud. I asked him to pull any records he could find on Derek, any complaints, any investigations. I asked him to trace Derek's transactions for the last 2 years. I told him about the request for $50,000, about the subsequent request for $75,000 that Emma had brought to me, about the inconsistent stories and the way Derek had manipulated my daughter. "Give me 48 hours, Morris said. "I'll see what I can find. Where are you?" I told him I was at home and he said not to worry, that sometimes people like Derek revealed themselves eventually. That instinct never lied. I thanked him and hung up. As I stood in my kitchen, my face still burning, something shifted inside me. I was done avoiding this. I was done pretending it would go away. I could feel anger building underneath the pain and the shock, not the hot, immediate kind of anger that leads to throwing things or shouting. The cold kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've been made a fool of and you're going to do something about it. I need to tell you how I got here, how a man like me, who'd walked away from law enforcement to build a normal, quiet life, ended up making that call to Detective Morris. Before my career in finance, I was a cop. A detective, actually, and a good one. I worked homicide and organised crime for 12 years before deciding I'd had enough of the darkness. I'd seen too much. Murdered families, gang violence, suicide victims. I'd brought too much of that weight home with me, and it was destroying my family. My marriage was suffering because of it. Emma was just a little girl back then, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I remember coming home after a particularly bad case and finding her trying to hide from me, scared by something she'd seen in my face, something dark that I couldn't quite hide. Sarah tried to talk to me about it. She'd say, "You need to get help. You need to find another job. This work is consuming you." But I didn't listen. I was proud of what I did. I was catching bad people. I was making the world safer. That seemed to matter more than my daughter's fear or my wife's tears. So I made a choice, finally, one night when I got home and found Sarah asleep on the couch, waiting for me, and Emma had cried herself to sleep in her room. I couldn't do it anymore. I walked away. I put myself through night school while working in private security, basically doing background checks and risk assessments for companies. It was boring work, but it paid bills and I got to go home at a reasonable hour. Then I moved into financial analysis, working for investment firms, and eventually I started my own consulting business. It paid well, better than I could have imagined, and I was good at it too, methodical and detail-oriented, the kind of skills from my detective days that transferred perfectly to spotting financial irregularities and fraud patterns. I built a steady, predictable life with Sarah and our kids. We bought a nice house in a good neighbourhood. We sent them to good schools. Emma went to university on a full scholarship and came out with a degree in marketing. Tom, my son, became an accountant. Everything was comfortable and safe. That was everything I'd wanted when I left the force. That was what I'd sacrificed my career for. And then Emma met Derek, and everything started to unravel. Before the soup and the phone call, there was Derek's request for money. About 3 months before that dinner, in early August, Derek called me. He wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us. That was unusual. Derek and I didn't really hang out one-on-one. We went to family dinners, we saw each other at events, but we didn't go to coffee together. I agreed anyway. We met at a coffee shop near my office, and Derek was nervous. I could tell. He kept stirring his coffee, not drinking it, just stirring. Finally he said, "I need to ask you something. I need a favour." He was asking for money, $50,000. He said it was for a business opportunity, a real estate development project that his firm was putting together. It was a sure thing, he said, the kind of investment that doesn't come around often. If he could get in on the ground floor with some capital, the returns would be substantial. 40–50% annually, maybe more. He said he knew this was a lot to ask, but he thought of me as family, and he wanted to give me the opportunity to be part of something big. He wanted my help. The way he asked was smooth, practiced. I realised later he'd probably asked other people the same thing. I told him I'd think about it and I'd talk to Sarah. That was my first instinct, to include my wife in any major financial decision. Derek seemed satisfied with that. But when I got home and told Sarah what he'd asked, she immediately said no. "There's something wrong," she said. "People don't just ask for that kind of money out of the blue, not if they're legitimate, not if the investment is as solid as he's claiming." I should have listened to her. Sarah has good instincts, but I thought maybe I was being too cautious. Maybe Derek really did see me as family. Maybe this was his way of including me in his success. So instead of saying no, I asked Derek for more details. I asked to see the business plan, the financials, the documentation, the contract for the project. I asked to meet his business partner. I asked reasonable questions. Derek got angry. He said I was questioning him, that I didn't trust him, that it was insulting. He said if I was going to be like that, if I was going to question every detail, then I clearly didn't believe in him. He said Emma had warned him about this, that I always had to dissect everything, that I never just went with my gut, that I was the reason Emma wasn't happy. When I pushed harder for details, he stopped asking about the loan entirely. But something had shifted. He started making comments about me, little digs disguised as jokes, pointing out my perceived failures. He'd say things like, "Not everyone can be a real risk taker," or "Some people just don't have the killer instinct." And most devastatingly, he was poisoning Emma against me. I could see it happening in real time. She was becoming colder toward me, more defensive of him, more critical of every choice I made. When I'd suggest something, she'd push back and suggest Derek's way instead. She started bringing Derek's opinions into conversations about my life, my career, my choices. Derek says you should be more aggressive in the market, or Derek thinks you've been too conservative your whole life. Sarah kept warning me that we needed to address this before it got worse. She'd say, "You need to have a conversation with Emma about Derek. You need to set some boundaries." But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that my daughter was being manipulated by this man. I kept thinking it would blow over. I kept thinking that if I just gave him time, Derek would show his true colours and Emma would see it. So I avoided the issue. I didn't talk to Emma. I didn't confront Derek. I just retreated into my work, and that was a mistake. That's when the real pain started. That's when the ridicule and the betrayal became a daily thing. Derek made a point of coming to every family event. My birthday came around that August, and he showed up with a gift, something expensive, something flashy. He insisted on toasting me at dinner, but the toast wasn't a celebration. It was a performance. He talked about how I'd worked hard my whole life and never really gotten anywhere, how it was good that I could enjoy my modest retirement eventually, how some people just weren't built to think big. Everyone laughed. It was supposed to be a joke. Emma laughed too. A month later, Sarah's birthday came around, and Derek spent half the evening on his phone taking calls about deals he was making sure everyone heard how much money he was moving around. He'd interrupt conversations to say things like, "Sorry, I'm just closing a deal worth $3 million, or "My investor partner is texting me from Dubai right now." Meanwhile, I'd brought Sarah flowers from the garden. They were beautiful, but somehow they seemed insignificant next to Derek's ostentatious displays of wealth. He'd make a point of asking me about my work in that tone that made it clear he found it boring. "So how's the day job going?" he'd say, like I was a teenager working at McDonald's. "Still playing it safe in the finance world? Must be nice to have such a predictable life, never taking any real risks." Sarah would shoot him a look, but she'd rarely say anything direct. Emma would laugh or jump in with her own comment. "Yeah, Dad, you're so conservative. Derek's out there making real moves." I'd try to respond with humour, but nothing ever worked. If I defended myself, I looked defensive. If I stayed quiet, I looked weak. Every interaction became a trap, and it wasn't just at family events. Emma started bringing Derek to company parties where I'd run into colleagues. He'd make comments loud enough for people to hear about how my career had plateaued, how I was the kind of man who helped other people make money but never got rich himself. I watched people's opinions of me change in real time. People I'd worked with for years started treating me differently. They'd be more polite, more distant, like they felt sorry for me. My wife watched it all happening and felt helpless. One night, after Derek and Emma had left after dinner, she found me in my study, just sitting there in the dark. "Why don't you stand up to him?" she asked. But how could I? If I confronted him, he'd tell Emma I was being aggressive, that I couldn't handle criticism. If I got angry, it would confirm everything he'd been telling her about me being a volatile, controlling old man. He had me completely trapped. So I swallowed it. I took it. I let him humiliate me in front of people I cared about and people I didn't know, because I didn't know what else to do. The comments accumulated like weight, like stones in my chest. I'd wake up in the morning already anxious, thinking about when I'd see him again, what he'd say, how Emma would look at me. I'd find myself making excuses not to go places. I stopped going to my regular golf game because Derek had started joining sometimes and I couldn't face it. I turned down invitations to company events. I even started working late just to avoid being home when Emma might call. Sarah watched this happen, and it broke her heart. She'd see me avoiding her family, withdrawing further and further, and she knew it was because of Derek, but she felt like she couldn't do anything to stop it. Then came the incident that made everything explode. Derek had gotten into some serious financial trouble. Emma called me one day in early September and she was upset. She was crying. She told me that Derek had made some bad investments, that some deals had fallen through, that they were in significant debt. Could I help them? Could I just help them out? When I asked how much, she said $75,000. That was a significant amount of money. Not something that would bankrupt me, but not nothing either. I asked for details. What had happened? What kind of investments? Where had the money gone? Emma got defensive immediately. She said if I really loved her, I would just help without all the questions and doubt. She said I was acting like I didn't trust Derek, like I didn't believe in him. When I asked to see the documentation, to understand what had happened so we could prevent it from happening again, she was furious. She said I was being selfish, that I was using money as a way to control her and Derek, that I was sabotaging their marriage because I couldn't stand to see her happy with someone else. Derek, of course, fed into it perfectly. He called me directly and told me that my refusal to help proved I didn't love Emma, that I valued my money more than I valued my daughter's happiness. He told me that real families helped each other without all the conditions and suspicions. He told me I was toxic. Those were his exact words. You're toxic, and you're making Emma miserable. When I tried to explain that I just wanted to understand what had happened, he hung up on me, and Emma didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. My daughter, who I'd raised, who I'd paid for college, who I'd been there for every major event in her life, wouldn't speak to me because I'd asked questions about $75,000. I tried calling her. She didn't answer. I tried texting. She responded with one message saying, "I can't talk to you right now. You've really hurt me." Those words destroyed me, not because they were true, but because I knew Derek had put them in her mouth, and I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't explain myself without making it worse. So I suffered in silence. Sarah told me I should give them the money just to preserve the relationship. "What's the money worth if you lose your daughter?" she asked, and she was right. But something in me, something from my detective days, some instinct I'd never quite lost, told me there was something wrong about this whole situation, that there was more going on than Derek was telling us. Still, I was close to giving in. I was close to just handing over the $75,000 to make the pain stop. The isolation was getting to me. Not seeing my daughter, knowing she was angry with me, feeling like I was losing her. Sarah saw it too. She could see me breaking under the pressure. "Just give him the money," she'd say some days. I was weakening. But somewhere deep down, that detective's instinct kept whispering that there was something fundamentally wrong about this whole situation, that there was a lie at the centre of all this. I was saint, starting to think maybe I should just give Derek the money, just to preserve the relationship with my daughter. I was preparing to do exactly that when Emma called me on a Thursday evening in early November. She said Derek wanted to have dinner, a family dinner at Sarah's house. He said he wanted to clear the air, to make peace with me, to start fresh. Emma sounded hopeful. She said Derek had been thinking about things and he wanted to apologise for how he'd been acting. He wanted to patch things up with the family. It seemed genuine. I agreed. We set it for the following Saturday. I should have known better. I should have trusted my instincts. But I wanted to believe that Derek had come to his senses, that he'd realised how destructive his behaviour had been. And that was my mistake. Because what I walked into that Saturday night was not a peace offering. It was an ambush. And it came with hot soup and betrayal. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours after I hung up with Detective Morris, my face still burning. The burn was fading slightly now, leaving behind a tight, raw sensation, like a bad sunburn that had gone too far. I could see the redness in the mirror across the room, red streaks down my neck, across my cheeks, spreading toward my ears. It would bruise. By tomorrow there would be purple marks mixed with the red, evidence that this had actually happened, that my daughter had stood up for a man throwing hot food in my face and told me I deserved it. I kept replaying it. Not the soup. I could get past the soup. Physical pain was straightforward. It was immediate and understandable. It would heal. No, what I kept replaying was Emma's voice. "He's right, Dad. You deserved that." Not the shock of the heat on my skin, but the betrayal in those words. My daughter, who I'd helped with her homework when she was 7, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd walked down the aisle at her wedding, had just sided with a man throwing boiling liquid in my face and told me I was wrong to even question it. Sarah had followed me to the kitchen after I left the dining room, and I'd held up my hand. She'd wanted to say something, wanted to comfort me or rage on my behalf. But I needed to be alone. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what the hell was happening to my life. I went to the bathroom and splashed cool water on my face, which burned more. Then I went to my bedroom. Sarah came in later, maybe 20 minutes after I'd locked myself away. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat on the edge of the bed and watched me. I could see in her face that she was angry, but also heartbroken. She'd always been closer to Emma than I was, I think. They had that mother-daughter bond that I'd never fully understood, and seeing our daughter turn on me like that, with her husband standing right there approving, it had hurt Sarah too. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "For what?" I asked. "For any of this. For not stopping him earlier. For not being more forceful about what I saw in Derek from the beginning." I told her it wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault except Derek's. He'd deliberately done this. He'd systematically isolated me from my daughter and turned her against me, and then he'd thrown soup in my face as a power play, a way to prove that he had dominance in this family, that he had dominance over me. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. And that was when I realised I'd already made the call, that I'd already started something that I wasn't sure I could stop. Detective Morris would be investigating Derek now. It would take time, but I knew Morris. I knew that if there was something wrong with Derek's finances, if there was fraud or embezzlement or any kind of crime, Morris would find it. Morris was thorough. He was one of the best detectives I'd worked with, and he owed me a favour from years ago when I'd testified on his behalf in a case. So now Morris was going to look into Derek's background, Derek's business dealings, Derek's finances, and whatever he found would be the beginning of the end. The days that followed were surreal. Life continued around me like nothing had happened. Sarah went to work. I went to work. I made conference calls and reviewed financial reports. But I was operating on autopilot. Part of me was here in the office, and another part was with Morris, waiting for his call. Waiting to know if my instincts had been right. Waiting to know if Derek was actually the criminal I suspected he was, or if I was just a paranoid, bitter man who couldn't accept that his daughter had chosen someone I didn't like. The uncertainty was almost worse than the burn on my face. The burn was healing. The marks were fading. But the uncertainty was growing, expanding, eating away at me from the inside. I couldn't stop thinking about that dinner. I couldn't stop replaying the moments before the soup was thrown. Derek had been building to something. He'd been testing the waters with those comments about my career, my life, my choices. He'd been carefully constructing a narrative where I was the villain, where I was holding him and Emma back, where I was the problem that needed to be solved. And when I didn't take the bait, when I didn't get defensive or angry, he'd escalated. He'd decided that humiliation was the next step. Public humiliation. In front of Sarah, in front of Tom and Linda, in front of our friends. He'd decided to assert his dominance by literally dumping hot food on me and seeing if I would fight back. And when I didn't, when I just left, he'd probably felt like he'd won. He'd probably felt like he'd proven his point, that he was the stronger one, the one in control, the one who would win this family in the end. He'd have Emma convinced that I was weak. He'd have turned her against me completely, and he'd be positioning himself to take everything. The money, the house, Sarah's future, my daughter's future, even though she didn't realize it yet. The more I thought about it, the more my mind worked through the implications, the clearer it became that I wasn't just upset about a personal betrayal, I was frightened. I was frightened for my daughter. I was frightened that I was going to lose her to someone who had absolutely no regard for her safety or well-being. Derek only cared about Derek. That was becoming increasingly obvious. I kept my phone on me constantly now. Every time it buzzed, I thought it might be Morris. Every text message, every call, I checked it immediately. 3 days passed, 4, 5. I started to wonder if Morris wasn't finding anything, if Derek was actually legitimate, if I was overreacting and making a terrible mistake. But I'd committed now. I'd set things in motion. On the 6th day, Morris called. It was a Friday afternoon. I was at my desk staring at my computer screen without actually seeing anything on it. My phone rang and Morris's name appeared. I answered immediately. "It's me," Morris said. "I found something. Actually, I found several somethings." My heart rate accelerated. "Tell me," I said. There was a pause. "Not on the phone. Can you meet me? There's a coffee shop on the north side of the city about 10 minutes from your office. Meadowbrook Coffee. Can you meet me there in 30 minutes? I said I could and hung up. I told my secretary I was taking a personal call and was leaving for the day. I didn't wait for her response. I grabbed my coat and my keys and I left the office. My hands were shaking as I drove. I didn't know what Morris had found, but the tone of his voice had told me everything I needed to know. It was bad. It was worse than I'd suspected. Derek wasn't just in financial trouble. Derek wasn't just manipulative and cruel. Derek had done something criminal. Morris was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived at the coffee shop. He looked the way he always looked. Dark hair greying at the temples now, the lines around his eyes that came from years of interrogating suspects and looking at crime scenes. He had 2 coffees on the table, already set down and waiting. I sat across from him and he slid one over to me. "First of all," Morris said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is preliminary. I'm still digging. But what I've found so far is enough to raise significant red flags about your son-in-law." Morris opened a file folder that was sitting on his lap. Inside were printed documents, records, reports. He spread them out on the table in front of me. "Derek Mitchell has a gambling problem," Morris said. "Not a casual thing. A serious, compulsive gambling addiction. He's been going to casinos in Nevada, Alberta, and right here in Winnipeg. We're talking multiple times a week. Over the last 18 months, he's lost approximately $430,000. I felt my stomach drop. "On what?" I asked. "On what games? How?" Morris flipped through the papers. Mostly high-stakes poker and blackjack. He was using his business as a front. He was taking investors' money, promising them returns on real estate developments, and then using their money to fund his gambling habit instead. He slid another document across the table. "This one is a cease and desist from a property owner. Derek was supposed to develop a commercial building in downtown Winnipeg. He accepted deposits from investors totaling $1.2 million. He never started the project. He spent the money and then told the property owner the deal had fallen through due to financing issues. The investors are still waiting for their money or their returns." "Jesus Christ," I said quietly. Morris nodded. "There's more. He's facing potential criminal charges for fraud and misappropriation of investor funds. There's an investigation being opened by the Securities Commission, and your daughter may be implicated." I looked up sharply. "What? How?" "She's listed as an officer of his business entity. She may have known what was happening, or she may have been completely in the dark. Either way, there could be legal implications of her if this goes to trial." I sat back in my chair. The coffee in front of me was getting cold. I couldn't process this. Emma, as an officer of the company, had she known? Had she been part of this? Or had Derek used her name without her knowledge? Either way, she was exposed now. She was vulnerable, and Derek had done this to her. He'd set this trap and our daughter had walked right into it without even realizing what he was doing. "What should I do?" I asked Morris. He sipped his coffee, his expression serious. "You need to talk to a lawyer. You need to document everything. The request for money, the conversations you had with Derek about investment opportunities, the dinner that happened on Saturday night. You need to write it all down with dates and details, and you need to talk to your daughter. She needs to know what's coming so she can prepare herself and get her own legal representation." I nodded slowly. That was going to be impossible. Emma wasn't speaking to me. Emma believed that I deserved soup thrown in my face. How was I supposed to tell her that her husband was a criminal who'd used her as a business entity to facilitate his fraud? I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, going through documents with Morris. He showed me bank records that proved Derek had transferred investor funds to casino accounts. He showed me emails where Derek had promised returns to investors that he had no intention of delivering. He showed me property records that showed no development had ever taken place. The pattern was clear. Derek had run a systematic fraud scheme, taking money from multiple investors, promising them real estate development returns, and then gambling away the money. When the money ran out, he'd simply stop responding to investors and move on to new victims. There were at least 6 other investors besides the ones Morris had initially documented. The total amount involved was close to $2 million, and Derek had no intention of paying any of it back because he didn't have it. He'd gambled it all away. "How much longer until he gets arrested?" I asked Morris. "Depends on the paperwork," he said. "The investigators need to coordinate with the RCMP, the Securities Commission, and the local police. I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks, maybe less if they prioritize it, but I wanted to give you a heads up first. I wanted you to know before it happened so you could prepare yourself and prepare your family. This is going to be a public thing. It's going to be in the newspapers. Emma's going to have to deal with the fact that she was married to a fraudster and that she was his business partner whether she knew it or not." I drove home in a daze. The afternoon sun was starting to angle lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway. I thought about calling Emma, but what would I say? I thought about going to see her, but she'd probably slam the door in my face. I thought about texting her with a warning, but Derek was probably monitoring her communications anyway. The control he had over her was complete, or almost complete. He hadn't expected me to call Morris. He hadn't expected me to start investigating him independently. He'd thought throwing soup in my face would intimidate me, would make me back off, would establish his dominance once and for all. He'd completely misjudged me. He'd underestimated what I was willing to do when I realized my daughter was in danger. Sarah was in the kitchen when I got home. She'd been waiting for me, I could tell. She'd probably been looking out the window, watching for my car. The moment I walked in, she could read my face. "Tell me," she said. So I did. I told her everything Morris had found. I told her about the investors, the gambling addiction, the fake real estate deals. I told her that Derek was going to be arrested. I told her that Emma was implicated and that she would need legal representation. I told her that the family was about to become the subject of newspaper headlines and gossip and speculation. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. "What are we going to do?" she asked. And that was when it hit me. I was going to do something. I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the authorities to take their course. I wasn't just going to let Derek's arrest be the end of this story. Because Derek didn't understand consequence. Derek didn't understand that actions have repercussions. Derek had lived his entire life believing that he could manipulate people, lie to them, use them, destroy their trust, and face no consequences. He'd done it to investors. He'd done it to my daughter. He'd done it to me. And he'd done it while throwing soup in my face and making my daughter say she was proud of him for it. That was when I started to plan. Not consciously at first. It started as just thinking, just working through the problem, just understanding the scope of what Derek had done. But somewhere in that thinking, a plan began to form. Derek needed to understand consequences. But more than that, Derek needed to understand that he'd made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd thought he could control me by controlling my daughter. He'd thought he could intimidate me by throwing soup in my face. He'd thought he could silence me by making Emma take his side. But he'd missed something crucial. He'd missed that I had resources. I had connections. I had knowledge of how to investigate people and find truth. I had Detective Morris in my corner. And most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. Derek had already taken everything he could take. He'd taken my daughter's trust in me. He'd taken my sense of security in my own family. He'd taken the one relationship that mattered most to me and turned it into a weapon against me. There was nothing more he could do to me that was worse than what he'd already done. So what could I do to him? What could I do that would make him understand the magnitude of his mistake? I started gathering information. I worked with Morris to get copies of all the documents related to Derek's fraud. I created a comprehensive timeline of Derek's requests for money, his false promises, his lies about the investment opportunities. I compiled a list of all the investors he'd defrauded, reaching out to some of them personally, understanding their stories, understanding what he'd taken from them. One man had lost his retirement savings. One woman had taken out a second mortgage on her house based on Derek's promises. One elderly couple had liquidated their life savings because Derek had promised them a 15% return. These weren't abstract victims. These were real people whose lives Derek had damaged. And Derek had no remorse. Derek had thrown soup in my face and smiled. I made copies of everything. I made a comprehensive file with documents, timelines, investor statements, bank records. I had Morris help me verify everything, make sure it was accurate, make sure it would hold up to scrutiny. And then I started reaching out. I contacted the other investors. I told them what I'd discovered. I shared the documentation with them. I helped them understand the scope of Derek's deception. I encouraged them to file formal complaints with the authorities. I pointed them toward lawyers who specialized in fraud cases. I became, essentially, an unofficial investigator and an informal advocate for Derek's victims. Within a week, the number of formal complaints filed against Derek had doubled. Within 2 weeks, the media had started picking up the story. A local news outlet ran a segment about Derek Mitchell, the real estate developer who'd defrauded his investors. They interviewed some of the victims. They laid out the timeline of his fraud. They showed his face on the evening news, and Emma saw it. Sarah told me that Emma had called. She'd been crying. She wanted to talk to me. She wanted to understand what was happening. I went to see her on a Wednesday evening. She'd moved into her own apartment by then, separate from Derek because she'd finally understood that something was terribly wrong. I remember knocking on her door and feeling a rush of something I can't quite describe. Relief, maybe. Or just the need for my daughter to know that I'd been right all along. Not in a vindictive way, but in a way that said, I've always been trying to protect you, and now maybe you'll understand that. When she opened the door, she looked broken. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking, like she'd physically shrunk under the weight of the betrayal. Her eyes were red from crying. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly, and I could see that she'd been wrong to believe Derek, wrong to say I deserved the soup, wrong to turn against me. But I could also see that she knew it now. She understood it completely. We sat in her living room for hours. She told me how Derek had carefully isolated her from me, how he'd made her doubt my motives, how he'd convinced her that I was jealous and controlling and threatened by his success. She told me how he'd never actually told her about the investments, how she'd just signed the documents he'd given her, thinking they were related to their house or their marriage. She'd been completely ignorant of what he was using her name for. She'd been his unwitting accomplice, the business officer who'd never actually done anything, just a name on documents, a way to make his company look legitimate. When she found out about the fraud, about the money, about the victims, she'd realized in an instant what he really was. He was a predator, and he'd preyed on her the same way he'd preyed on everyone else. "I said you deserved it," Emma said at one point, her voice breaking. "I said he was right to throw soup in your face. I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I believed him." I told her that it wasn't her fault. I told her that Derek was skilled at manipulation, that he'd been manipulating people his entire life, that she shouldn't blame herself for falling for it. I told her that the important thing now was that she understood the truth, and that she could move forward with that knowledge. But inside, I was thinking something else. Inside, I was thinking about Derek, about what he'd done to my daughter, about how he'd tried to turn her into a weapon against me. I was thinking about how he'd thrown soup in my face and smiled. I was thinking about how he'd believed he could do this with impunity. The arrest came on a Friday morning just as Morris had predicted. Derek was taken into custody by RCMP officers at his office. There were photographers outside, there were news crews. His mugshot appeared on the evening news with the headline, "Local Developer Faces Fraud Charges." The story detailed the extent of his crimes. It talked about the investors he'd defrauded. It mentioned Emma by name, noting that she'd been listed as a business officer, but was not believed to have been involved in the fraudulent activities. The public humiliation that Derek had been trying to inflict on me had instead landed on him. and he had no idea who was responsible. Derek thought I had simply reported him to Morris out of spite. He didn't understand the scope of what I'd done. He didn't know that I'd spent weeks coordinating with the other investors, building a comprehensive case against him that went far beyond what the initial investigation had uncovered. He didn't know that the news stories, the media attention, the multiplying complaints, all had my fingerprints on them. To him, I was just an angry father-in-law who'd gone to the cops. He didn't realise I'd orchestrated a systematic exposure that would follow him for the rest of his life. 3 months later, Derek was indicted on 12 counts of fraud and misappropriation. The trial was set for 6 months down the line. The prosecutors had a devastating case. The documentation was overwhelming. The victim testimony was powerful. Derek's lawyer suggested a plea deal, but Derek refused, apparently still believing that his charm and his explanations would get him out of this. He was going to fight it. He was going to insist on his innocence. And he was going to lose spectacularly, in public, on the record, where everything he'd done would be permanently documented for the world to see. That was the revenge that felt right to me. Not violence, not even confrontation. Just the simple, complete exposure of who he really was. Derek had built his entire existence on lies and manipulation. He'd built an image of success and superiority. He'd built a narrative where he was the winner and I was the loser, and I'd simply pulled back the curtain and shown everyone the truth. And now he was paying the price. Emma was rebuilding her life, working with a lawyer to extricate herself from the business entity. The other investors were pursuing civil cases, and Derek was facing prison time. The soup that he'd thrown in my face, the humiliation he'd tried to inflict, the daughter he'd tried to turn into a weapon against me, all of it had backfired completely. He'd miscalculated me. He'd underestimated what I would do when pushed into a corner. He'd assumed I would either fight him physically or roll over and accept defeat. He'd never considered that I would simply expose him completely and let the system take its course. That was the revenge that worked. That was the lesson Derek was learning now. Actions have consequences, and sometimes the worst consequence isn't violence or confrontation. Sometimes it's simply the truth. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 1 year to the day after Derek had thrown soup in my face. I sat in the courtroom gallery next to Sarah and Emma, watching as Derek was led in wearing a suit his lawyer had probably advised him to wear, trying to look respectable, trying to look like a man who had made mistakes rather than a deliberate predator. But I could see the calculation in his eyes. I could see that he still believed he could talk his way out of this, that his charm would eventually work on a jury the way it had worked on Emma, the way he'd thought it would work on me. He looked at me once during that first morning and smiled that same smile he'd worn when throwing soup in my face. That confidence, that absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, and it was devastating. They presented the bank records showing investors' money flowing into Derek's account, and then immediately out to casino payment processors. They presented emails where Derek promised returns he had no intention of delivering. They presented the testimony of 6 victims, each one describing how Derek had convinced them to hand over their life savings. The woman who'd taken the second mortgage on her house sat in the witness stand with tears streaming down her face as she described telling her husband that they might lose their home. She explained how she had spent 3 years living in fear that they would be foreclosed on, that her family would end up on the street because she'd believed in Derek's promises. The elderly man who'd liquidated his retirement explained how he'd gone back to work part-time at 72 years old because of the money Derek had stolen. He talked about the stress, the health problems that had developed from the financial anxiety, the way his wife had cried herself to sleep for months after they realised their money was gone. There was a younger couple, both teachers, who'd combined their savings trying to make a down payment on a house. Derek's promised returns were supposed to give them just enough extra to afford the property. Instead, they'd lost everything and had to postpone their wedding because they couldn't afford it anymore. The judge let each victim speak during the trial, and it was watching Derek's face as they testified that told me everything I needed to know about his character. He didn't look remorseful. He looked annoyed, like he was inconvenienced by having to listen to people explain how he'd destroyed their lives, like they were the problem for not understanding that this was just business. These weren't abstract numbers anymore. These weren't just victims in a file somewhere. These were real people whose lives had been damaged, whose futures had been altered, whose trust had been shattered, and Derek sat in that courtroom and acted like they were the ones being unreasonable. Derek's lawyer tried to mount a defense based on the argument that the investments had been risky, that Derek had simply been optimistic about his projects, that the failure to deliver returns wasn't criminal fraud, it was just bad business judgment. But the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was clear. The bank records were irrefutable, and Derek's own emails, in which he'd explicitly lied about the status of projects that were never started, sealed his fate. In one email to an investor, Derek had written that the commercial development was in final stages of approval and that he expected to begin construction within 2 weeks. That email was dated 18 months before his arrest, and the project had never been started. The property owner testified that Derek had never even contacted him about development timelines. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. The prosecution played that email for the jury, and then showed them photographic evidence of the property sitting empty and undeveloped. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On the 4th day of the trial, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. 5 hours to decide the fate of a man who'd tried to steal my daughter's future, who'd thrown soup in my face and smiled. I sat in the hallway and felt my heart racing, knowing that whatever happened next, Derek's life was about to change. The foreman stood and announced the verdict. Guilty on all 12 counts, guilty of fraud, guilty of misappropriation, guilty on every single charge. Derek's face didn't change for a moment. Then something flickered across his expression. A moment of understanding, a moment where the reality of what was happening actually penetrated his carefully constructed confidence. He remained mostly still after that, his expression mostly neutral, but I could see that he was processing. He was realizing that this was real. He was realizing that the charm and the manipulation that had worked on Emma, that had worked on so many people, wasn't going to work on a jury armed with bank reco, written emails and victim testimony. He was realizing that he was trapped, that there was no way out, that this was actually happening to him. But it was happening. It was real. And the best part was that the entire city had watched it happen. The trial had been covered extensively by the local news. Derek's face had appeared on every broadcast, not as a successful developer, not as a man of charm and sophistication, but as a criminal, as a fraud, as a predator who'd stolen from ordinary people and destroyed their lives. News anchors had showed his mugshot alongside photos of his victims. They'd displayed the emails where he'd lied. They'd interviewed the people he'd defrauded. The narrative that Derek had tried so hard to construct, the image of himself as superior, as someone who'd made good, had been completely dismantled in front of the entire city. Now he was just Derek Mitchell, the con man. That was his legacy now. That was what people thought when they heard his name. That was what would come up when anyone looked him up online or in public records. Not success, not achievement, fraud, prison, predator. Emma didn't come to the courthouse for the sentencing. She'd recovered enough to understand what Derek was, but she wasn't ready to watch him be punished for crimes she'd been implicated in, even though she'd had nothing to do with them. I understood that. I'd wanted to spare her the whole thing, but she had insisted on attending the trial itself, on bearing witness to the truth about the man she'd married. The sentencing happened a month later, and the courtroom was packed. The victims were there. The media was there. The judge made it clear that this was a serious case with serious consequences. The judge spoke about the breach of trust, about the systematic nature of Derek's fraud, about how he deliberately targeted vulnerable people and stolen their futures. He talked about the impact on the victims, about the lives disrupted, about the dreams deferred. He talked about how Derek had shown no remorse, how he'd blamed his victims for not understanding the risks, how he'd tried to maintain his innocence even when faced with overwhelming evidence. Dense. Having reviewed all the evidence and heard all the victim impact statements, The judge sentenced Derek to 8 years in federal prison. 8 years for stealing $2 million from people who'd trusted him. 8 years for destroying lives. 8 years for throwing soup in my face and believing he could do anything he wanted without consequences. The woman who'd taken the second mortgage wept when the sentence was announced. The elderly man put his head in his hands. The young teachers held each other. They'd gotten justice, but they wouldn't get their money back. They wouldn't get their time back. They wouldn't get the peace of mind back. They were going to spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of Derek's choices. After the sentencing, Derek was led away in handcuffs by court officers. I watched him as he walked out, and I noticed that he didn't look at me. He didn't look at Emma. He didn't look at any of the victims. He just looked straight ahead, his expensive suit now seeming like a costume that no longer fit him. I felt something release inside my chest as he disappeared through the courtroom door. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It wasn't joy or triumph. It was something more like closure. Derek had gambled and lost. He'd tried to manipulate me and failed. He'd attempted to establish dominance and instead ended up handcuffed, walking toward a cell where he would spend the next 8 years paying for his choices. That was justice. That was consequence. That was the universe reasserting balance after Derek had upset it so thoroughly. What Derek didn't realize was that his punishment didn't end with the prison sentence. The judge also ordered him to pay restitution to the victims. The total amount was substantial, calculated to compensate them for their losses. Derek would be making payments for decades, even after his 8 years in prison were over. Every dollar he earned would be garnished. Every financial move would be scrutinized. For the rest of his life, Derek would be paying for what he'd done. The newspapers covered the sentencing with appropriate gravity. Local developer sentenced to 8 years for defrauding investors, the headline read. The article detailed his crimes, his sentence, the victim impact statements. There was a photo of Derek from his mugshot, unsmiling, looking exactly like what he was, a criminal. Someone whose charm meant nothing now, someone whose lies had caught up with him. Some newspapers ran follow-up stories about the victims, about how they were moving forward, about the organizations that were helping them rebuild their lives. One local radio station did an investigative piece about investment fraud and how people could protect themselves. Derek's actions had become a cautionary tale. I cut out the newspaper article and kept it in a drawer in my office. I don't know why exactly. Some part of me wanted proof that this had actually happened, that Derek was really going to prison, that I hadn't just imagined this entire journey from that dinner table where he'd thrown soup in my face to the courtroom where he'd been convicted. Sometimes I would take it out and read it again, reassuring myself that it was real. The 6 other victims, with the help of a class action lawyer, filed civil suits against Derek to recover their stolen money. Most of them knew they would never see a dollar. Derek had already spent what he'd stolen. The casinos had kept the money. There was nothing to recover except the satisfaction of having a judgment against him, having it officially recorded that Derek owed them hundreds of thousands of dollars that he would never be able to pay. But that judgment was powerful in its own way. That judgment would follow Derek for decades. Even after his 8 years in prison were over, even when he was eventually released at some point in his 50s or 60s, that civil judgment would be hanging over him like a sword. Creditors could come after him. His wages could be garnished for the rest of his working life. Any money he earned could be seized to pay back what he'd stolen. Any assets he acquired could be seized. If he ever inherited money, it could be seized. Derek was going to be chasing his own tail financially for the rest of his life. Always behind, always owing, never able to get ahead. I thought about that during the civil trial. I thought about Derek understanding that there was no escape, that the consequences of his actions were going to follow him forever. The judge in the civil case ordered Derek to pay the victims in total $1.8 million, with interest accruing at 8% per annum. That meant Derek would owe more money every single year that the debt remained unpaid. Within a few years, he'd owe more than he'd even stolen. Derek's life, for all intents and purposes, was over. Not just because of the prison sentence, though that was significant, but because of everything that came with it. The criminal record that would show up on any background check. the victim restitution orders that would attach to his earnings forever, the civil judgments that would follow him through bankruptcy court and debt collection agencies, the public humiliation that would persist in newspaper archives and online databases, the knowledge that everyone who saw his name or looked him up would know exactly what he'd done. I'd orchestrated that. I'd systematically exposed him. I'd coordinated with the other victims to ensure that his crimes were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I'd worked with them to file civil suits. I'd helped them find lawyers. I'd encouraged them not to give up, not to settle for less, not to let Derek off easy, and it had worked perfectly. Derek had thrown soup in my face thinking it would humiliate me, thinking it would establish his dominance in our family, thinking I would cower and accept defeat. Instead, it had been the beginning of his end. He'd miscalculated so completely that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I thought about the elderly man working part-time at 72 years old, and the sympathy evaporated. Derek deserved what he'd gotten. A week after Derek's sentencing, I met with Emma for coffee. We hadn't been alone together since I'd gone to her apartment when she'd finally understood what Derek was. She looked different now, not recovered exactly, but changed. Changed in the way that people change when they've had their worldview shattered and had to rebuild it from the ground up. She was thinner, I noticed. Stressed. But there was something else in her eyes too. Clarity. Understanding. She looked at me and I could see that she saw me for the first time in over a year. Not through Derek's lens of manipulation, but as her father, as someone who'd tried to protect her. We sat in a coffee shop, the same kind of anonymous public space where I'd met with Morris to learn about Derek's crimes, and she thanked me. She actually thanked me for investigating her husband, for exposing his fraud, for making sure he faced consequences. Her words were careful, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but they were genuine. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I don't know how to apologize for what I said, for believing him, for—" Her voice trailed off. I told her that I'd done what any father would do. I told her that protecting her had been my priority from the moment I realized what Derek was. I told her that this wasn't on her. She was a victim of his manipulation just as much as the investors were. Maybe even more so because she was married to him, because she'd let him into her life completely. She cried a little bit, not from sadness, but from something like relief. Like she could finally let go of the guilt and the betrayal and the confusion that had been eating at her since that dinner. "I said you deserved it," she said, referring to the soup, her voice breaking slightly as the memory of it surfaced. "I said that Derek was right to throw soup in your face. I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I stood there while my husband hurt you and I took his side." I reached across the table and held her hand. I told her that Derek had been exceptionally skilled at manipulation, that his ability to make people doubt themselves and their judgment was one of his primary weapons. I told her that she shouldn't blame herself for falling for his lies because he'd been doing this his entire life. He'd perfected it. He'd studied people and learned how to get into their heads and turn them against the people they loved. I told her that what he'd done to her was deliberate and calculated and not her fault. But inside, I was also thinking that Derek had learned an important lesson now. He'd learned that you can't control everyone. He'd learned that sometimes when you underestimate someone, when you assume they'll roll over and accept defeat, when you throw soup in their face and smile thinking you've won, they do the opposite. They investigate. They expose. They make sure the world knows exactly what you are. 3 months after Derek's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through his lawyer. Inside was a handwritten note on prison stationery. The handwriting was shaky, nothing like the confident signature Derek had practiced for years. I could almost hear the desperation in those words, the way he'd finally understood that his situation was real and permanent, and that there was nothing he could do about it, no appeal he could file, no way to charm his way out of this. He wrote that he had made terrible mistakes, that prison had given him time to reflect on his actions. He wrote that he regretted what he'd done to me, to Emma, to all the investors. He wrote that he'd been struggling with his gambling addiction for years and that he'd let it consume him. He wrote that he wanted to apologize and that he hoped I could forgive him, that he hoped Emma could forgive him, that he hoped the victims could somehow find it in their hearts to forgive him. He wrote that he was a changed man, and that he'd been attending support groups and counselling. I read the letter once, twice, 3 times. I read it and I felt nothing, or I felt something, but it wasn't what Derek wanted me to feel. I didn't feel sympathy. I didn't feel forgiveness. I felt the confirmation of what I'd already known, that Derek was a manipulator to the core, that even in prison, surrounded by the consequences of his actions, he was still trying to manage his image, still trying to convince someone that he was worth saving, still trying to play the victim. He said he'd changed, but his letter was calculated to appeal to my sense of justice and decency. He knew how I thought, he knew what I valued, and he was trying to use that knowledge even now. So I read the letter once more and then I burned it. There was nothing Derek could say that would matter anymore. His apologies didn't mean anything when he was serving an 8-year sentence for fraud. His regret didn't help the woman who'd lost her retirement. His hope for forgiveness didn't restore the life savings of the elderly man working part-time at 72. His claim that he'd changed didn't undo the damage he'd done to my daughter. Derek had made his choices. Derek had thrown soup in my face and smiled while doing it. Derek had believed he was untouchable, that he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. And Derek had learned the hard way that nobody is untouchable, that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who will bring you down. The letter was symbolic, though. It was Derek understanding, perhaps for the first time, that he had lost. Not just the trial, not just his freedom, but the game itself. He'd tried to manipulate me, and I'd beaten him at his own game. I'd used my intelligence and my resources and my connections to expose him completely, and now he was writing letters from a cell trying to convince me that he'd changed, that he understood, that he regretted his actions. But regret only matters if it's genuine, and Derek's regret wasn't about what he'd done to others. It was about getting caught. Life settled into a new normal after that. Emma filed for divorce and it was finalised within 6 months. She recovered some of what Derek had spent through the restitution orders, enough to pay for the legal fees and start rebuilding her life. She went back to university to study psychology, wanting to understand why people like Derek were the way they were, wanting to understand the mechanisms of manipulation and control so she could help others recognise the warning signs before it was too late. Sarah and I watched her rebuild herself with a kind of quiet pride. We'd been hurt, we'd been betrayed, we'd been humiliated, but we'd survived it and come out the other side stronger. Our family was fractured but not broken. Emma would never fully trust again the way she had, but she was learning to trust herself and her instincts. That was something. I didn't need Derek to suffer anymore. He was already suffering. He was in a federal prison, in a cell with concrete walls and bars, with a criminal record that would follow him forever and define him for the rest of his life. He was paying restitution that he could never fully pay, with interest accruing every single year. He was going to spend the next 8 years and possibly longer thinking about the moment he'd thrown soup in my face and smiled, about the moment he'd underestimated me, about the moment he'd set in motion the events that would lead to his complete and total destruction. The revenge that I'd orchestrated was elegant in its simplicity. I hadn't needed to confront him. I hadn't needed to fight him. I hadn't needed to take any physical action. I'd simply stepped back and let the truth do the work. What I learned from all of this was something I hadn't expected to learn when Derek threw that soup in my face. I learned that revenge doesn't have to be loud or violent or destructive. Revenge is sometimes just the systematic exposure of truth. Revenge is sometimes just allowing someone to face the natural consequences of their own actions. Revenge is sometimes just stepping back and letting the system work, letting the evidence speak for itself, letting the jury decide based on facts rather than charm or manipulation. I'd called Detective Morris that night when Derek threw soup in my face and smiled. I'd made one simple phone call asking for help. That one call had set everything in motion. That one call had led to Derek's investigation, his arrest, his prosecution, his conviction, and ultimately his imprisonment. One phone call had been enough to start the avalanche. One phone call had been everything, because behind that call was documentation, was truth, was evidence that couldn't be denied or manipulated away. Derek had built his entire life on lies and manipulation, and lies have a way of coming unravelled when you pull the right thread. I'm not a violent man. I'd never been someone who believed in physical retaliation or confrontation, but I'd been someone who understood how to investigate, how to find truth, how to gather evidence and build a case. I'd spent years in professional investigation. I'd learned how to think like someone trying to hide something. I'd learned how to follow the money. I'd learned how to connect the dots and see the pattern beneath the surface. I'd used those skills not for revenge in the traditional sense, but for justice. I'd used them to protect my daughter. I'd used them to expose a predator. I'd used them to make sure that Derek understood that there are consequences for the choices you make, that you can't go through life manipulating people and destroying their lives without eventually facing accountability. The 6 victims had gotten their justice. Their cases were complete. Derek had been convicted and sentenced. The legal system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. Derek learned that lesson. I hope he's still learning it every single day he spends in that federal prison, looking at the walls, thinking about the moment he decided to throw soup in my face, thinking about the moment he smiled at his own cruelty, thinking about the moment he underestimated me and my ability to respond. That's the revenge that sticks. That's the revenge that matters. Not the momentary satisfaction of humiliation or physical pain, but the permanent knowledge that your actions brought about your own destruction. The knowledge that your own choices led directly to your imprisonment. Derek built the trap. Derek filled it with his lies and his fraud and his cruelty. Derek walked into it, and Derek paid the price. I just made sure he couldn't escape.